negotiation with European allies who are more dependent on Russian energy supplies and who he acknowledged may not be able to join in immediately. What impact will this U.S. action have on Russia? Reporter Naomi Segal put the question to Dr. Yonatan Freeman, an international relations expert at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem.
Well, I think first and foremost, it's going to impact the economic well-being of Russia, as sanctions were even placed on Russia when it went into Crimea. So there's going to be an impact on the ability for Russia, as even President Biden said, to fund its current operations. And that's something that could really put pressure on certain individuals and people inside Russia. And in turn, that might cause more pressure on the Russian government to maybe change the way it's doing things so more relief can come to the people. But overall, I think that these announcements really continue to put Russia in a corner. So on the one hand, as I stated, it could cause Russia, as they hope, to lower its and limit its assault there in the Ukraine. But on the other hand, it might motivate Russia to take more drastic measures. And we already saw announcements by Russian officials saying that this is a declaration of an economic war on Russia. So it could really backfire as well.
Yes, because there really are perhaps two parallel timelines that are engaged here, what's happening on the ground and how it's Russia, the economy, Putin are starting to feel the pinch from these sanctions.
Yes, I think both ways, and I think that's also part of the reason why we're seeing more and more motivation by certain actors, and I think one of the major actors who are doing it is Israel in terms of trying to mediate between the two parties, because we are seeing that both what's being done against Russia and what Russia is doing on its own, or even in response, this could really lead to a tougher situation, not just for the Ukrainian people, but also for the Israeli people and people over the world as well. So I think it really brings more motivation for people and for governments, just like the Israeli government, during the Sabbath to send a plane over to Moscow. It really tells of the dire situation that we're in.
Does Israel have that much leverage in terms of mediating? Because there are certainly also additional interests that Israel sees at play here above and beyond what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, but how it's impacting interests for Israel.
Well, I think generally speaking, the biggest interest that Israel has, and has always proven it from all over the world, is really its survivability. We want to survive. And I think that's the biggest interest here, because if this war becomes even bigger, involves different types of weapons, and causes a major worldwide situation that we haven't seen since the end of World War II, this is a major threat on Israel as well. Because in the end, we need the world to be peaceful for us to flourish. So that's the number one interest here. Number two, since the war began, Bennett has been the only Western leader to physically meet Putin. This tells a lot as to how Israel is highly regarded as a country that can bring experience, bring mediation, the fact that we understand both the West, we understand Russia, we have the ear of Biden, we have the ear of Putin, we have many, many people who are linked or who are from the former Soviet Union, so we also have a cultural understanding of the two parties, and even many of these individuals are members of our government. Bennett went there with Zev Elkin, the Minister of Housing, and he's from the area. And so we have a lot of abilities to understand all the parties and to convey messages between the parties. And that, I think, is also what Bennett has been doing, not just talking to Putin, but also conveying a message, for example, from Biden or Zelensky to Putin as well.
And Israel also has to strike that balance in terms of the stance being taken by the U.S. in relation to this conflict.
Yes, we have to strike a balance. We have very special relationships with Russians over the years, especially when it comes to operating in Syria with regards to our Air Force. We've also been involved with Russia when it comes to finding the bodies of our soldiers. You remember a few years ago, they helped us bring one of our fallen back to Israel. We have also been involved with Russia when it comes to their own mediation vis-a-vis Hamas in Gaza. Every so often they send someone over. We also have very big trade relations with them when it comes to wheat and other things. So we have to keep in mind other interests. And obviously also we have many, many Jewish people who live in Russia as well. And that's part of the reason, by the way, that El Al continues to be a airline that flies to Moscow, even though most, if not all, Western airlines stopped flying to Moscow already.
So finally, circling back to where we began talking about the sanctions, do you foresee in this situation more a coalescing broadly in the international community with EU companies ramping up those economic sanctions? Do you see policies taking a stiffer or a more broader approach in terms of what they're willing to engage with Russia?
It seems that we are going towards a direction of toughening the sanctions. But on the other hand, and we just saw that with the announcement of the boycott of Russian oil, it's also causing some disagreements within the EU. And some of the countries are saying, we can't do that. We're still dependent on Russian oil and gas. We can't do it. So on the one hand, we might see a stronger unity when it comes to more sanctions on Russia. But, however, the more harsher they become, this might bring about cracks within the coalition in the West, because some countries might not be willing to do the same.
Dr. Yonatan Freeman of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Almost half of Israelis, 48%, support the current policy of Western countries to impose harsh sanctions on Russia, but not